You have to take seriously the notion that understanding the universe is your responsibility, because the only understanding of the universe that will be useful to you is your own understanding. Terence McKenna. Traditionally, astrology associates the zodiac signs with particular parts of the body or specific organs, but this is neither helpful nor memorable for us, because the body of a living being, of course, isn't made up of these separate individual components and specific parts. It's made of vital systems that are all intricately linked and interworking. And they have a lot of connections and interactions that are important to understand the nature of. So to both facilitate the learning of these systems, memorization of important functions, and create more meaningful associations, I have arranged the zodiac as the 12 systems of the body. In reality, of course, there is more nuance and detail, and my intent was not to be exhaustive with these descriptions, but to hopefully spark some curiosity in you, and inspire you to explore the topic more in depth. After all, this is your vehicle in this life, and knowing as much as you can about it can only serve to strengthen you and help you adapt. There is a common dismissal of anything medical or physiological as too difficult or complex to comprehend. The doctors don't even know what they are doing, and there is no point in trying to understand it all. But I think this view is harmful. It's okay to be wrong and to need to update your understanding. The information in these slides is extremely generic, straight from Wikipedia. I am not going to read it verbatim, but provided it as a quick study guide as I go over the archetypal roles of the systems. My own knowledge of anatomy comes from some pre-med classes I took and cadaver lab. Fun hack for anyone pursuing nursing or medical, just study Latin, and it's an auto win. My classmates were a little annoyed by my strung-out demeanor at the early morning classes. Most of the time I didn't bother to scrub off the goth makeup after a late club night, and yet I aced the tests anyway, while they were all working and trying very hard. Why are you even in this class? Your major is architecture. Well, because the credits counted. And I'm very glad that they did. It was a truly unique opportunity, and I'm extremely grateful for the people who chose to donate their bodies. I learned so much, and I feel the understanding reached a lot deeper than just how the body works. I was further blessed by the opportunity later on to see an exhibition in Venice of the sketches of Leonardo da Vinci brought to life in preserved cadavers. So in the spirit of that, and the incredible contributions that he made, I have presented them here alongside the notes. First is the muscular system, which is associated with Aries. This is what allows for us to move. We have muscles that we can intentionally flex and contract and move about the world at will. And we also have involuntary muscles, such as in the heart. If we were to think about these systems elementally and their interrelations, we would see an obvious connection between the muscular system and the cardiovascular system then, which are both under the element of fire. Engaging our muscles actually helps with the pumping of blood and moving fluid around in the body. And that's part of why exercise is so important. And that also is a large factor in maintaining our body heat and distributing it. When thinking about bodily systems or anatomy in general, I think the muscular system is what springs to mind most obviously and visually, so it's helpful and fitting that that would come first in the list and be the most memorable. It's also interesting to note that across any color classification association for anything zodiacal, the single most consistent and obvious is Aries associated with the color of red. Muscles are ironically the most obvious and the most overlooked aspect of health and fitness because of their association with masculinity or being a jock or going to the gym, and what have you. But development of muscle is incredibly important for all people to protect and facilitate the function of all of the different organs, because above the skeleton, the muscles are what's providing the cushion and structure and support to the organs and helping the fluids move. So we see in the archetype of Aries martial discipline and Olympic sporting excellence the cultivation of these muscles to be in peak condition to perform on the spot and be able to achieve incredible feats of physical prowess. And always that is coupled with the mental cultivation and the ability to control the self and to choose the right moment and pick one's battles and not just go through life in a sort of crude, brutish way, powering through everything and exerting unnecessary force. It's interesting that muscles are formed, they're grown by damaging them, by straining them, and then the repair is what makes them come back stronger in the future. Next is the endocrine system, which is associated with Taurus. This is the system of our hormone-secreting glands, and I'm going to be doing a much more detailed series on neurotransmitters and hormones soon in the future. But the hormones in particular are chemical transmitters which are sending signals to all of the different parts of the body. Hormones are secreted under all kinds of different conditions. We're receiving stimuli from the environment, such as stress. We secrete stress hormones, and those tell our body how to respond to what's happening to us. And they are all very interrelated, and some of them build out of the components of other ones and use the same resources. We need to provide the building blocks for them by ingesting primarily protein, and we can't necessarily create these hormones without the necessary components. So that's why it's so important to have a balanced diet and to have those components available. Hormones create feedback loops. The two most notable are fight or flight and rest and digest. They are somewhat mutually exclusive, so our body tries to put us into an entire mode where the organs are synergizing and working together to address the current concern. Hormones are very finely tuned and can respond to things as subtle as exposure to sunlight or as aggressive and obvious as a stress situation or an attack or a startling sound. And this is an interesting contrast to the previous system. Of course, the muscles are very intentional, and the endocrine system we largely don't have such willful control over. It's these factors in the environment and the habits that we formed that factor into our secretions, and in order to impact them, we have to change our total system and our habits, which is very intimately connected with the archetype of Taurus. Are you taking the bull by the horns, or is it the one in control? Our hormones and emotions are extremely powerful in driving our motives and our behavior, and so getting those things in balance is essential for our total well-being. The key thought here is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and the endocrine system determines how all of the components relate to one another. And this is very relevant to the mother archetype, the Earth Mother of Taurus, who is looking after the total well-being of the system and moderating and ensuring that things are working efficiently. Next is the nervous system, which is associated with Gemini, where the endocrine system communicates between the different parts of the body with chemicals. The nervous system uses electrical impulses. The central nervous system, which is made of the brain and spinal cord, is collecting all of the sensory input, all the things that we're seeing and hearing and feeling, and interpreting all of those signals. But besides the brain, which is the main thing we think of, there are nerves running all throughout our body and receiving different kinds of signals from our organs and tissues that the brain is also keeping track of. Archetypically, we associate Gemini with rational thinking and logic and high-level processing, but it is this lower-level intuitive sense that we get from all of the stimulation in the lower nerves that culminate in an integrated understanding and impression of what's going on in the body and what should be done about it, right? We don't logically think to ourselves about eating necessarily. We have a sensation of being hungry and we respond appropriately. It's important to note that it's very much possible to overthink and to actually overstimulate ourselves into a state of stress simply by consciously thinking and creating scenarios for ourselves, which may not necessarily reflect the reality that we're living in or the environment that is currently affecting us in our bodies. And so we have to take great care to double check and make sure that those ideas are in alignment with what is actually occurring to us. And next is the female reproductive system, which is associated with Cancer. In most groupings of the systems of the body, reproductive is counted as, one concept, but obviously we have the two sexes which are handled separately. So in our system we have 12. The female is responsible for actually gestating the fetus, and so the physical demands are somewhat more strenuous than the counterpart. For our purposes, we will be including the breasts as part of the female system, although in typical medical groupings, this is a secondary sexual characteristic and not necessarily involved in the primary creation of the offspring. Archetypically, Cancer, which is ruled by the moon, is associated very strongly with a woman's monthly cycle and with the water element of the womb. So this is the protective, sheltering, nurturing, feminine energy. When we think of the water element in terms of life and evolution, it springs to mind the primordial soup. And there are many themes of the fountain of youth, of longevity associated with the water element. And even if you do not personally possess this particular body system, it's very important to understand how it works and to study it as much as possible, because there are parallels between the way that our own body functions, the way that we create new life, and the cycles of this earth and what's going on in our environment. Next, we have the circulatory system, which is associated with Leo. This is also known as the cardiovascular system, and we can use those terms interchangeably for our purposes, although there is overlap with the lymphatic system in traditional definitions. The main difference that I would like to highlight is that the circulatory system is enclosed, whereas the lymphatic system is open. The heart and arteries and veins are self-contained, and blood does not exit the system. Its filtration is all handled within those major blood vessels. The heart, of course, is the strongest muscle, and the circulatory system is the way we transport large quantities of nutrients and oxygen and more throughout the body by mechanical means. Archetypically, of course, we associate heart with courage, and this pairs very nicely with the symbol of the lion and the archetype of Leo. It's also associated with strength, as we see in the tarot card, the lion with its mouth held open. We also have a traditional association of the heart with emotion, with intuition, and with our empathy towards other people. So that's interesting, this symbol of our personal vitality and strength being the source of our ability to be kind or big-hearted and to find commonality with those different from ourselves. Since Leo is associated with the ego and with our self-interest, it's interesting, this paradox of that not being mutually exclusive with our sociability and our humanity and goodwill towards one another. Next, we have the digestive system, which is associated with Virgo. For our purposes, we're going to be grouping the digestive with the excretory system. This is the way by which we obtain nutrients, by taking food into our body, processing it into usable pieces, and eliminating the waste that's not useful for us. I often associate Virgo with the philosophy of Epicureanism, and it's interesting the parallel between our disgust mechanism, or the things that we find unpalatable, and the female selection mechanism that is embodied in Virgo. The analyst, the one who is looking at the preferences and making determinations about what is potentially harmful and what is helpful. This is also interesting in the context of Virgo's victory condition, looking at medicine and hygiene and wellness, and how that selectivity plays into our ability to ward off parasites or poisons or unwanted things. This can be a problem, of course, when there's too much pickiness and we're not eating enough, we're not ingesting enough of the right things, or we turn our noses up at things that are otherwise very nutritious and good for us. So it's important to always keep in balance the known wisdom of what we should be doing for ourselves and our particular tastes and preferences, which might be too highly tuned and sensitive. As an earth element system, this is connected very closely to the endocrine system as far as cravings and the sensation of hunger itself and our overall state of receptivity toward the digestive process. It's also very interesting that in order to aid in digestion, we need to take in lots of different things that are not necessarily nutritionally dense, such as fiber and water, to make sure the whole system works correctly. And more interesting is that our bodies are not necessarily our own. We are not single entities, we are actually ecosystems. And within our guts, we have this beautiful array of flora. So it's an interesting balance that we have to strike between warding off potentially harmful other entities into our body and maintaining the ones who are already living there and benefiting our total system. Next, we have the Integumentary System associated with Libra, also known as the Endocrine System. That was a new vocab word for me. This is the largest organ of the body, of course, the skin, and all the things that come with that, the hair, the nails, and the sweat glands. It's very interesting that our ability to sweat is the main reason that we've been able to live in every corner of the earth. We can make ourselves clothes to deal with the cold, or sweat to deal with the heat, and it gives us a huge range of endurance in a wide variety of conditions. They say that beauty is skin deep, and it's interesting to see this system correlated with Libra, the sign ruled by Venus, and associated with mature femininity. But our skin has evolved as a shield to protect us from the elements, and I think that that archetypal identity is extremely apt. We react to the UV radiation coming to us from the sun by having skin and developing pigment to protect us from the radiation. Our skin is the barrier between us and our external environment. It protects us, but also is highly sensitive and collects a lot of information about our surroundings. So in Libra, we see the appreciation for aesthetics and for physical appearance with the virtue that it is conveying about our own personal adaptability. It's very important to maintain the system for our overall well-being, not just for aesthetic purposes or for looks. We need to oil our feathers, so to speak, on a regular basis in order to make sure that we are interfacing correctly with our environment. Next is the male reproductive system, which is associated with Scorpio. The main purpose of this is to produce sperm to fertilize potential eggs. Genetic males, of course, possess both an X and a Y chromosome, whereas females, which are the default in utero, have two X's. It's interesting that when the fetus begins to produce testosterone, that is the point of divergence to set him on the path to becoming fully male. Other species might accomplish this by things like a difference in temperature. And it's interesting how many different characteristics we inherit from one parent or the other, or the way that our genetic sex impacts different parts of our physiology. Archetypically, Scorpio is commonly associated with sex, reproduction, and sexuality. Sex, unfortunately, still carries a heavy cultural taboo to being talked about. It's almost more correct to use in humor or very flippantly or in porn than to talk about in any sort of scientific detail. But learning about the hormone cycles of the male is just as important as the ones we typically associate with females. Testosterone levels impact a whole host of other conditions in the male body, and it's important for these things to be in balance, not only for sexual performance, but for overall health. Both reproductive systems are associated with water signs, which I think is no accident, although in the ancient world, of course, there were many wild speculations about what caused erections, one of which being that they were inflated by air. Next, we have the urinary system, associated with Sagittarius, also known as the renal system. This is the way that the kidneys are able to filter the blood, a process that we do manually when there is a dysfunction of the kidneys through dialysis. A common ailment of the kidneys is the kidney stone, which is a condition where a solid mass accumulates, commonly surplus of calcium. And I thought that particularly Sagittarian phenomenon was that there have been studies done that riding roller coasters might assist in the clearing of kidney stones. Here the fire signs come full circle, with the urinary system filtering the blood from the circulatory system, which is pumped by the muscular system. The act of cleansing, or letting go of what is no longer necessary, pairs very nicely with the archetype of the sage, which is associated with Sagittarius. Traditionally, Sagittarius is associated with the thighs and with travel, and it's interesting that the urinary system actually has a lot to do with our ability to cover distance by regulating our bodily fluids. Though much of this is completely involuntary through osmotic forces acting over membranes, the part that we are most familiar with and aware of is the urge to urinate itself and the imperative nature of that. And so it's interesting how we must achieve a balance between taking enough liquid in on a regular basis and those passive exchanges that are happening deep within ourselves, and the very active and obvious reaction that we have when the urge arises. Next is the skeletal system, which is associated with Capricorn. Our spine and skeleton provide the upright support that we need to be able to move in a bipedal fashion throughout our world. It's one of our main evolutionary innovations compared to other animal species. Our bodies have evolved an effective combination of stiff, solid components, the bones, the semi-solid components, the cartilage and joints, and all of the soft and squishy tissues ranging from muscle to fluid. Because the bones are all that's left behind when the animal has died and the rest of the tissues have degraded away, these are very commonly associated as symbols of mortality and the ephemeral nature of life. Capricorn is archetypically associated with time itself and with structure and stability and rigidity, and so it's very fitting that this would be associated with the skeletal system. Over time, we experience degradation of our joints and connective tissues through wear and tear, and our bones can lose their density through conditions like osteoporosis. So it's important to be sure and supplement with calcium and other minerals. Motion itself, especially gentle motions like walking, are essential for maintaining the health of this system, which is easy to overlook because it's not one of our fleshy, active organ systems, but it is important to uphold the structure of the rest. This poses an especially appropriate caution to the Capricorn archetype not to become too sedentary or rigid or set, and to maintain healthy motion. Next is the respiratory system, which is associated with Aquarius. This is the way by which we take oxygen into the body and expel carbon dioxide, which is toxic in high amounts. The breath, or prana, is associated with being a life-giving force, and deep breathing techniques are often thought of as ways to invigorate the body and to give us greater function. This concept was also held by the Greeks in the form of pneuma, and the commonly known respiratory ailment of the lungs is pneumonia, in which they become flooded with excess fluid and are not able to properly inhale and exhale. Our sense of breathing is extremely sensitive, and there are many things which can negatively impact it, such as stress and irritants in the lungs, and our histamine reactions can be very strong in conditions such as asthma. So there is a strong connection between the fear impulse or panic and our ability to breathe and regulate our emotions. The archetype of Aquarius is associated with being light and easy, and this correlates to the respiratory system in the form of breathing easy. Being too anxious or fearful of the future is the paradox that Aquarius is able to overcome through regulation of the breathing. And lastly, we have the lymphatic system, which is associated with Pisces. And for our purposes, this is synonymous with the immune system. As we talked about before, there is crossover with the circulatory system. The parts of the immune system that you are probably more familiar with occur in the bloodstream as the white blood cells, which are actively fighting infections, but the lymphatic system plays a vital role in clearing up the aftermath of those battles and keeping our blood clean. So the lymphatic fluid is the system that is open to the rest of the body and is actively collecting the waste from all of the cells, unlike the bloodstream, which is, of course, the closed system. The lymph nodes are actively screening and checking all of that lymphatic fluid for problems, and when they become swollen, most commonly you'll feel the hard lumps in your neck. That's indicative of an active infection, and more fluid is sent to combat it. So the blood itself is not sensitive. It doesn't have a way to screen or regulate itself, right? We need the kidneys to be able to remove toxins actively, but the lymphatic system is highly sensitive and is paying attention to all of the fluid that is circulating, like the lubricant within our body that keeps everything running smooth. So as our digestive system is performing the function of screening foreign or unwanted entities very actively and expelling things mechanically through throwing up, the lymphatic system is doing this for us automatically, screening at a much tinier level and filtering it for us. So this is similar to the archetypal difference between Pisces, which is the intuition, the emotive, the automatic, and Virgo, which is the much more analytical and thoughtful and active. And to complete the water element, the lymphatic system is very closely related to both reproductive systems, and lymphatic tissue is often clustered directly around reproductive organs. Thank you so much for sticking with me through that. I hope that some of this was helpful, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. I hope you have a great rest of the day.